turn it on and off after everybody talks. Because,
Did you two get a chance to look at the Spanish version of the big picture of the Bible? Before we start the live stream, just like to announce that we're going to have a little abbreviated class tonight so that we can baptize two wonderful people here that are here this evening, Manuel and Fernanda. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that when we get to the end of class. But hopefully we can finish up in about 45 minutes, and then we can have some songs. And then I'll take the good confession from them both, and then we'll make the arrangements for the baptisms. That'd be a great way to end tonight. And they're just a great couple, and I'm so thankful to have had a chance to study with them and their very wonderful, receptive hearts. I just gave them a Spanish copy of the big picture of the Bible, and I wanted them to read through it and make sure they understood it. And they both said tonight, we are so committed and sure about this. And I just love that, because that's exactly the spirit that you want. Okay, let's begin our class with prayer. Lyle Gradden, would you lead our minds, please?
Our Almighty Father, we are so grateful that we come together in peace and be able to worship you and be able to study your word as we're doing tonight. We're thankful, Father, for the book of Genesis. This tells us about the beginnings of man and the promises that you've made to Abraham and the hope that we have through the Messiah that was being told about in advance and in those promises. We're thankful, Father, for Manuel and Fernanda and the attitudes that they express and their zeal for you and for making sure that they're doing the things that are needed for glorifying you. And this baptism this evening is their opportunity to become a part of the church and be part of of Jesus' body and have their sins taken away as a result of this baptism. And we're so grateful for the faith that they're expressing in this act. And we're encouraged, and we pray that we can be encouraging to them. We pray all this in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Amen. Okay, whether you're here or online, if you would turn to Genesis 25, verse 11, that's where we're going to pick up from our study from last week. I always like to back up and make sure we can understand and see sort of the big picture. So Abraham, the father of the faithful, the one through whom all these promises have been given, 13 chapters in the Bible dedicated to the historical background of Abraham. And of course, the theme is the rest of the Bible, the nation promise, the land promise, and then the seed promise through Jesus. Then we have Isaac. I like to refer to him as the insignificant son of a significant father, Abraham, and the insignificant father of a significant son, Jacob. So he's like this faithful link between the two. We're going to talk a lot about Isaac tonight. And then we're going to find that he's going to repeat the sin of his father, Abraham. Then Jacob, of course, his name is changed to Israel. Of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the only one that's not going to have his name changed is Isaac. Remember, Abram was Abraham, and then Jacob had his name changed to Israel. So he's very important because he's the father of the Israelites, and his 12 sons will be the 12 tribes of Israel. 9 chapters dealing with Jacob. And this fellow is a conniver. He's going to mistreat his brother. He's going to lie. And this isn't because this is acceptable behavior. It's just that the Bible tells us what really happened. And these individuals are flawed. And so we can relate to this. I like to think about the studying of the book of Genesis as going back and reading your family album. Because all of us should be able to relate to these people as they all struggle with their faith and they had frailties. But Jacob's going to have a major change that we'll look at next week when he wrestles with this angel, and it's when his name is changed, and he's going to be a different person after that. And so there's just a lot of lessons we can learn. He's saved by grace in spite of his many, many flaws. Okay, let's look at some key points from Genesis 25. You'll notice verse 11, which is where we left off last week. And it came to pass after the death of Abraham. How old did Abraham live to be? 175, specially blessed of God. And God blessed Isaac, his son, and he's going to be specially blessed as well. He's going to live to be 180. And so he's going to be specially blessed of God, and they're going to dwell in Beer Lahoroi in the southern part of the land. And so it starts off by saying that just as Abraham was blessed, Isaac was blessed, and this little statement, Jehovah blessed Isaac, is elaborated upon later in chapter 26, verses 12 through 14. Someone like to read that, 12 through 14, if they can. Roy here is running around like CJ used to. Someone like to read Genesis 26, 12 through 14. Okay, Jim Bruins.
Now Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. And the man became rich, continued to grow richer until he became very wealthy, for he had possession of flocks and herds and a great household, so that the Philistines envied him.
Okay, so that's quite a statement. Again, this is sort of, I don't know, kind of adding on to what Abraham did. Where did Abraham get his wealth? He became very wealthy. It was almost exclusively from livestock, right? And he was a nomad, except for the cave of Machpelah. He didn't own any property. So he got his from being a herdsman. And he was very, very blessed by God. But now Isaac has some land that he's able to use. And the Philistines surrounding him, going to make a covenant with him. And it's very fertile land. And it says that God blessed him in that he received 100-fold on his crops, which is almost unheard of. I mean, this is obviously God reaching down and blessing him in a special way. And it says he waxed greater and greater until he was like the mightiest among them. The statement is made by Abimelech that you become mightier than we have, so much so he's going to become the object of envy. And so this is a reminder of the Abrahamic promise. God told Abraham, I'm going to bless you, and bless who? Your descendants. And so this is stressing the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise. Then in chapter 25, there's a paragraph here about Ishmael. And Ishmael, of course, is not the seed through which Christ is going to come. And he was just there because of a foolhardy plan of Abraham and Sarah to run ahead of God and to have him try to have offspring through Hagar. But because he is also from the seed of Abraham, it's important to realize that he is blessed. So these are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's handmaid, bare unto Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael by their names according to their generations. And then there's a bunch of names mentioned, and we're specifically told that there are going to be 12 princes that will come forth from Ishmael. And the Ishmaelites today are the Arabic peoples. They come from Abraham as well. That's why the Islamic religion looks back to Abraham as their father, as well as the Jewish religion and the Christian religion. So this fellow here is extremely important. This is also a fulfillment of Genesis 17:20. You remember when there was strife between Ishmael and Isaac, and Ishmael and Hagar had to be pushed away to make room for Isaac, that an angel appeared unto Hagar and says, basically, don't worry, because I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to bless your son and his descendants. And it says, an angel of Jehovah said unto her, behold, thou art with child, and thou shalt bear a son, and thou shalt call his name Ishmael, because Jehovah hath heard thy affliction. And he shall be as a wild ass among men. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his brethren. And she called the name, and the Jehovah spake with her, thou art a God that seeth. For she said, have I even looked after him that seeth me? Wherefore the well there was called Beer Lahoroi, which is the same well we just mentioned. And Hagar bare Abraham a son, and Abram called his name Ishmael. And so this is a fulfillment of that blessing, as well as the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise. So any thoughts about Isaac and Ishmael being blessed? Ishmael is going to live to be 137, by the way, which was also an indication of his being specially blessed from God. Now, let's go ahead and look at Genesis 25, beginning at verse 19. And this is where we introduce Jacob and Esau. So you remember before we looked at, looking for a wife and all the provisions providentially that were made for Isaac not to marry a Canaanite, but to marry a believer, someone that was spiritually minded. And so the servant goes up and God makes this arrangement for them. And so then he goes into her tent and he's comforted after his mother's death, and everything appears to be going wonderfully well, with one exception. And what's that exception? She's barren. 20 years she's barren. And again, there's a whole lot riding on Isaac and Rebekah having offspring, because the Abrahamic promise says you're going to be as the sands of the seashore and the stars of the heaven. I mean, this could stop in its tracks any time along the way, that these people don't have offspring who have offspring who have offspring. So it says in the text that finally they were waiting and waiting, obviously trying to have children. They're not successful. And then finally it says that Isaac prayed. I don't know why he waited 20 years to specifically beseech Jehovah about this, but he did. The Bible stresses in many places that God is in charge of childbearing, that he is the one who opens and closes wombs. And so he prays, and God says, okay. And so immediately after this, she conceives, and she winds up not just having one child, but two fraternal twins that are as different as night and day. So verse 21, and Isaac entreated Jehovah for his wife because she was barren, and Rebekah, his wife, then conceived. Now I want you to notice verse 22, and the children struggled together within her. Now, what is significant, do you think, about talking about these two unborn children in this way? Does it say the fetuses struggled within her? No, the children struggled within her. And it's going to give a prophecy about these two individuals, not just a clump of cells, but these lives that are in her womb that are important, and The only difference between them and someone outside of the womb is a little bit of time and nourishment. And so it talks about them as being children. And I think that's important, not just the fetuses. And so they're struggling so much, fighting it out in the womb, that apparently Rebecca is puzzled. You know, this conception is obviously of God. They didn't have children for 20 years. Then you have this very fervent prayer by Isaac, and then suddenly she gets pregnant. And so she says, how can this be? If this is of you, why are these children fighting so within me? This doesn't make any sense. Apparently she thought they were going to kill her. And so Rebecca inquires, what is going on? And God answers her inquiry. And Jehovah said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 people shall be separated from thee, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. So this is a prophecy. Obviously, when you have twins, one's got to come out before the other, even if it's just, seconds or a minute or so difference. One is older than the other. One typically that is the firstborn would get the birthright that it gets given to the firstborn. But we're told in this case, in God's plan, you've got these 2 souls. They're going to be separate nations, and the elder shall serve the younger, which is the opposite of the way things like that normally work, which again shows God's providential hand and care in this. So she's given this prophecy right up front that that your children fighting in the womb are sort of prophetic, because they're going to be doing this throughout their lives and their descendants as well. So, wow, what a thing for a mom to have to deal with, huh? And then it goes on and it talks about the manner of the birth and the naming of these 2 children and why they are named the way they are. And so it says, verse 24, and when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb, and the first came forth red all over like a hairy garment. And they called his name Esau, which means sort of rough or red. And after that came forth his brother, and his brother had hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. That is one that takes by the heel or surplants. So Jacob is the supplanter, and we're going to find in life he's going to supplant his brother Esau in regards to both the birthright and the blessing. And Isaac was 60 years old when she bare them. So here's this fascinating character study and analysis of Jacob and Esau. Jacob, the supplanter, and Esau, meaning rough or ruddy. Now, we're told later that, Jacob's name is going to be changed to Israel after he wrestles with an angel. And Esau is going to be changed to what? Edom. So he's going to be the father of the Edomite peoples. There's a whole book of the Bible, Obadiah, that talks about the sin and the pride of the Edomites as they dwelt in Mount Seir. And when Jerusalem is invaded, the Edomites are not going to help their brother. So way down the line in history, they are going to have issues one with the other. And the elder, which would be the Edomites, are going to serve the younger. And in 2 Samuel 8 and verse 14, a very important battle happens where David captures the Edomites. And so that was fulfilled in that particular passage. And as I mentioned, Obadiah talked about the pride of the Edomites. Why were they so proud? Where did they wind up settling? I already mentioned it. Yes, Mitchell?
They had kind of a fortress city on the mountain.
Yes, yeah. Mount Seir was way up high, and it was easy to defend. And for centuries. They were kind of there by themselves, and because they were up there in the mountain, a lot of the major conquerors would go through and just sort of wind up leaving the Edomites alone. So they weren't big enough or easy to access, and so oftentimes they were spared while Jerusalem was not. So they were proud, and Obadiah predicts that even though you're up there in your high mountain, God is going to bring you down because God is in charge of the rise and fall of nations. And the Edomites, like their forefather Esau, they're never very spiritually minded. And they just care about trade and taking advantage of Judah when they are able. In fact, the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, is directed in the first section of it specifically against Edom. And I think that's interesting, that's considered important enough to be listed here in Malachi, the last prophet to end the Old Testament. Says verse 2 of Malachi 1, I have loved you, saith Jehovah, yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith Jehovah, yet I loved Jacob. But Esau I hated and made his mountains a desolation and gave his heritage to the jackals of the wilderness. Whereas Edom saith, we are beaten down, but we will return and build the waste places. Thus saith Jehovah of hosts, they shall build, but I will throw it down again, and men shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom Jehovah hath indignation forever. For your eyes shall see, and you shall say, Jehovah be magnified beyond the border of Israel. So he's reminding them again of these people were wicked, and in spite of the fact that they were a part of the Abrahamic line, that because of their wickedness, they're going to be cursed. So this patriarchal family tree continues to be flushed out. You've got, of course, Abraham at the top, and then Abraham and Sarah give birth to Isaac, and then they find Rebekah, and then Rebekah and Isaac are married. 20 years later, she gives birth to these twins, Jacob and Esau. Okay, and the Bible tells us how these were different. Esau was a sportsman, very strong and hairy. Says he was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. In contrast, what does it say about Jacob? He was not so athletic. In comparison to Esau, he was weak and smooth. He hung around in tents and cooked with his mom. He was sort of a mama's boy. And so of the two, which seems like the one that would wind up being the leader, the one that would be in charge? Well, you would think it would be Esau, and he turned out to be Isaac's favorite because they went out hunting together, and he was really good at finding game and fixing venison for him and all that kind of stuff. But sadly, one of the real weaknesses of this genealogy through which God is going to work is going to be the problem of favoritism. And it's just really clear that Esau is his father Isaac's favorite, while Jacob is Rebekah's favorite. And, Rebekah is not being the good submissive wife here, is she? I mean, she's not pictured very well in the way she kind of encourages Jacob to later on deceive Isaac in his blindness. And this trait of favoritism is going to continue on and cause a lot of difficulty. So one of the things as parents we need to be careful about is that we love our children and treat our children equally. I remember when Amy and Allison were young, they frequently would come in and say, okay, whose picture do you like the best, mine or Allison's? Remember that, Amy? And our standard answer was, you know what? We love you both. We like them both. And we love you the most because you're the oldest, and Allison the most because she's the youngest. And they weren't very satisfied with that answer. But any rate, Amy and Jonathan are here from Indianapolis with their 3 children. And so please, they're here today. They'll also be with us, Lord willing, on Sunday. If you haven't had a chance to meet the Sims family, please take time to do that this evening. All right. So they were different in strength, and they were different in pleasure. Esau, as we said, was a skillful hunter, while Jacob was kind of a mama's boy. But the important thing is not those kind of outside externals, but of course, people's character. And though Jacob is deeply flawed, in spite of his being flawed and doing things that no doubt he should not have done, but he cares about the blessing. He cares about the birthright in a way that Esau does not. And so let's look at what happened here in Genesis 25:28 and following. It says in verse 28, now Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, which is, of course, deer meat, and Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob boiled pottage, and Esau came in from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, feed me, I pray thee, with that same red porridge, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. So this was red lentil soup, and that's apparently why he was called Edom from this incident, even though he was also someone that was red and ruddy from his birth, which many people believe indicate he may have had red hair. But at any rate, and Jacob said, sell me first thy birthright. So really, this is extortion, is it not? You know, it's his brother, and he comes in famished. I don't think he was literally going to die here. I think it's like we often say, I'm starved to death, and what we mean is we've missed a meal. You know, we're far away from starving to death, but we kind of feel that way at the time when we're very hungry. So he comes in from the field and he says, you know, I'm famished, you know, I'm about to die. Let me have some of this soup you're making. And he says to him, sell me first thy birthright. Now, I think in this context, that's that the oldest child, the elder, would usually get 2/3 of the inheritance and a lot of family responsibility and leadership of the family. And of course, that doesn't happen until the father passes, and usually on his deathbed, he will sort of put his hands upon them and give the appropriate blessing at the time. And I mean, there was already a promise, I assume Jacob knew about this, that his mom had told him that you're destined to be the one that is going to be the leader, not Esau. But he decides instead that he's going to sort of take advantage of his brother at a moment when he's famished. And Esau kind of flippantly says, okay, what difference does it make? If I die, what good's the birthright going to do me? And so Esau here, I think, should not have been so fleshly oriented, so focused on sort of, you know, God being the flesh being his belly, so to speak. And he's impulsive. He's thinking like this rather than thinking long term. And I've seen several sermons entitled, you know, what is your stew? What is your porridge? What is there out there that you'd give up for your spiritual birthright? What kind of sacrifices would you make? And oftentimes people that are not people of faith will, you know, give in to some sort of immorality or some sort of sin which causes them to give and to lose their soul, even though, you know, what they were exchanging it for was in retrospect next to nothing in comparison to what the gain could have been. So there's lots of applications to that, but Only a couple verses here, but he basically sells his birthright. And back then, oral commandments were binding. So we look at the character of Esau. He is referred to in the Bible as being profane. I want you to notice this. It says, Hebrews 12, 16 through 17, lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. For you know how that afterward, when he would have inherited the blessing, he was rejected. For he found no place of repentance, though he sought it carefully with tears. And so the term is used here in Matthew 25, 34, that after he finishes the meal, he says, verse 33, and Jacob said, swear to me first. And he swore to him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink and rose up and went his way. So Esau despised his birthright. In the Bible, it talks about Christ enduring the cross and despising its shame. In other words, he counted the shame of the cross as nothing because of the glory that was set before him. And so he despised his birthright. He counted it as nothing. He was very immature, very attuned to the flesh and living in the moment rather than being a person of faith. And with all of Jacob's flaws, at least he really cared, not just about the birthright, but about the blessing. And I want to make an important observation here. The Bible talks about Esau as being a very dangerous person that is profane. What is profanity? It's when you take something that is holy and treat it as common. You take the Lord's name in vain, for example. That's profanity. It's not reverencing God's name. And so this just simply means not that Esau was some terrible person, but that he just didn't care about spiritual things. And there's a lot of times, I think, especially in dating, that you have somebody who's tall, dark, and handsome and is a nice person and polite and caring in many ways. But if they're profane and they don't love the Lord and they don't really care about spiritual things, they're like Esau. And what's that going to do to your faith? How are you going to serve the Lord? And people need to be warned against the nice guys or the nice girls who are nice people, but if they don't care about the Lord and they don't believe, they don't have faith, they're profane in their character. And that's a dangerous thing too. So it's not just the wicked person you need to avoid, it's the person that just doesn't care about the things that really matter in life. And that's one of the lessons I think we get from Esau. So when it comes to character, when it came to the birthright, Esau despised the birthright, counted it as nothing, where Jacob valued it. Long-term thinker, person of faith. We also find there's a distinction here in regards to who they married. You often can tell a lot about a person's character by the kind of person they wind up falling in love with and choose to have as a part of their lifetime partner. And so it goes on to say in Genesis 26, verses 34 and 35, Esau was 40 years old, and he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. And they were a grief of mind unto Isaac and Rebekah. One translation says they made their life miserable. So Esau goes out. He doesn't care really about spiritual things, so he marries these Hittite pagans. Well, Jacob here is going to wait for a spouse that is a believer. And after Jacob succeeds in receiving the blessing from Isaac through deception and lies, Esau is going to seek revenge, and he's going to wait till Esau is going to die. Not Esau, Isaac's going to die, and then then take vengeance. And so Jacob's got to get out of Dodge right away. And it's fascinating. He leaves with really virtually nothing in his hand. He'd just been given this blessing. He's from a very wealthy family, but he's got to get out of town because his own brother's planning to kill him. Really sad. And that's when Jacob, he doesn't even have a pillow. He's got to use a rock for a pillow. Prays to God and asks God to bless him and says, if you do, I will give you 1/10 of all that I have back. So Jacob learns to trust in the Lord, and he's not going to plot revenge with Laban when Laban takes advantage of him, in part, I think, because of what he saw happen with Esau. So what are some lessons learned? God looks on the inside, not on the outside. And of course, who else are we specifically told about that in that regard? What is this passage said in connection with whom? David, right? And the Bible also says that David was ruddy in appearance. Interesting. A neutral person may be more dangerous than an overtly evil person. The choice of a mate reflects on our spiritual character and is very, very important. And the choices of long-lasting consequences. Choices have long-lasting consequences. Our descendants are affected for generations, as we find here, particularly with the descendants of Esau who become the Edomites. And it's really true. Sometimes the years teach us things the days never can. And people of faith are people who don't just live for this life, but for the next. They think long term. All right, in Genesis 26, I just want to go through this very briefly. There's a famine in the land, and God appears to him and says, don't go to Egypt. I want you to go to Gerar among the Philistines. And so that's exactly what he does. And it says, Isaac went unto Abimelech, king of the Philistines, unto Gerar. Now, Abimelech means my father is king. It's just a title like Pharaoh. So this is not the same Abimelech that Abraham dealt with. It'd be very unlikely. It's been about 40 years since Abraham dealt with a man named Abimelech. And here, twice, God repeats the promise to Isaac. I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heavens, and will give unto thy seed all these lands, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And then there's some other events that occur, and he does it again at the end of this chapter. And Jehovah appeared unto him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham thy father. Fear not, for I am with thee, and I will bless thee and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake. And he built an altar there and called upon the name of Jehovah. Now, he's repeating the promise, even though when he gets over into Gerar, he lies about Rebekah. It says in verse 7, and the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, oh, she is my sister. Actually, what relationship was Rebekah to Isaac? Yeah, he's a second cousin first removed, I think, or something like that. For he feared to say, my wife, lest the men of the place should kill me for Rebekah, because she was so beautiful to look upon. Does that sound familiar? What did Abraham say about Sarai when she was a bit younger, when she was also very beautiful and he was afraid? So he did the same thing, right? He said, oh, she's my sister, when the primary relationship was, of course, this was his wife. Where do you think Isaac got this idea? You think from dear old dad? Probably so. And I just think it's fascinating how children are often lengthened shadows of ourselves. And when they emulate the good traits, oh, that's very gratifying. But when we see sometimes them emulate some of our flaws and mistakes, that's really humbling, isn't it? That's why you always need to point the finger back up to God. Yes, Lyle?
You suggested that this has been 40 years, so it's very unlikely that it's the same. It's very unlikely that it's the same Abimelech. The only thing that's a little bit confusing about that is his right-hand man, Phicol, is the same as the one 40 years ago.
Interesting.
The commander of the...
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just-
Okay, that is interesting. I'd forgotten that that would be the case. I wonder if maybe Phicol was maybe younger and he just continued to sort of be the chief of staff for both. I don't know. But it seems unlikely that this poor Abimelech would have this happen to him twice under these circumstances. But at any rate, and then later on, there's this controversy over wells and things like that. And Isaac just keeps on moving on, even though they sabotage his wells. I think believing now that God's going to bless him regardless. And each time they drill for a well, dig for a well, they hit water. And so the Philistines are just amazed about this. And so Abimelech says, God must be with him. And so they make a covenant with him because they want to be allies, showing again that you bless those that bless you and curse those who curse you. So these folks want to ally with the descendants of Abraham, and here they want to ally with Isaac. Okay. Genesis 27, one of the things that's not obvious in the text is that when this occurs, Isaac is about 137 years old and blind. And it came to pass that when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau, his elder son, unto him and said, My son. He says, Here am I, Father. And he said, Behold, now I am old. I know not the day of my death. Well, that's true. He obviously thinks he might die. And remember, apparently Esau did as well, because he says, I'll wait for Isaac to die and then I'll take vengeance upon my brother. Well, again, as we mentioned at the beginning of class, he lives to be 180 years old. So he's going to live for like 43 more years. And he thinks he might die. But a lot of time's going to pass until that occurs. And so it says in Genesis 35, 28 and 29, that he's going to live to be 180. Also, you put all this together, there's a timeline that's mentioned in Bob and Sandra Waldron's excellent workbook on studying the book of Genesis, and he goes through all of this. And he says Jacob and Esau are 77 years old at the time of this deception. So you kind of get the feeling that these are much younger men than they are. And so when Jacob leaves, he's a 77-year-old man leaving and fleeing for his life. And he hasn't even started to have a wife or kids yet. And he's going to wind up being 91 when Joseph is born. So that also puts a lot of this on how God is with them and blessing them, and you sometimes miss some of that in the text. We don't have time tonight to really go through the details of this elaborate ruse led by Rebekah that causes such turmoil. But, Isaac is blind, so he can't see. And so Jacob comes in and he says, are you my son Esau? And Jacob says what? Multiple times. Yes, I'm Esau. And he says, your voice doesn't sound like Esau. So Rebekah had come up with this plan where she got some garments that Esau was known to wear. And apparently the ancients didn't change their clothes very much or worry too much about bathing, because she knew that the smell of Esau, which was on his garment, would cause Isaac, who couldn't see, to be more likely to believe that this is Esau because of the smell of the garment. And what else did she tell him to do to make it look like he was Esau? Yeah, got goat skins. Now, goats are really hairy. I can't imagine a human being having such hairy hands that you put goat skin on someone's neck and hands. So, I don't know, but anyway, it was convincing to Isaac. And so once he smelled what smelled like Esau, and he tasted this venison, which was so typical of Esau, and Jacob is just doing everything he can to deceive his own father and to get the blessing. And he does receive the blessing. And then Esau comes in right after Jacob departs from the scene, says, okay, here's your venison, go ahead, give me your blessing. And he says, what? I just gave you your blessing. He goes, no, it must have been my brother Jacob. See, his name is Supplanter. He's always supplanting me. This is so unfair. And he's weeping and crying. And now later on in life, he cares about what he didn't care about earlier, right? And so then he gives them a little bit of a blessing and says that eventually you'll be able to get underneath the yoke of the Israelites. So that's what happens later on in history as well. So that's pretty interesting. Who else tried to help God along like this, even though God had promised this from the beginning? Yeah, Sarah and Abraham, and what a mess that caused. I mean, God told them this would happen. They didn't have to do all of this. And it's just fascinating how God has just revealed for us what these people went through and how he worked with them anyway. Okay, I'm going to, perhaps talk about Jacob's birthright a little bit more later. But how does this thing turn off? How do you turn this off? There's not an off. This is this new pointer. Well, I'll just leave it up for now. It's strange. Any rate, let's go ahead and conclude with a prayer, and then we'll go ahead and commence with the baptism. Who's going to be leading our songs tonight? Seth, you going to be doing that for us? Okay, great. Fernanda Costello and Manuel